In this lesson, I want to talk to you about how you actually play the piano and the feel and the tone that comes out based upon how hard you play and what accents you play and things like that. Depending upon how hard you hit the piano, it'll play a different sample. And these multi-sampled keyboards have a tendency to have actual velocity switches where, you hit it at a certain, you can hit it, say, at a 10, and then when you hit it at 11, it'll switch to a completely different sound. And that's especially true of a cheaper model of keyboard. But anyway, so like for example, if I hit a key really softly, it's playing a waveform, an actual sound file from a little hard drive or something, or some kind of memory inside the keyboard that corresponds to a soft velocity. And if I hit a little harder, it sounds a little different, and it's playing a different set of waveforms. And if I hit it very hard, it plays a completely different set of waveforms other than that. And so it's important because depending upon the keyboard you have, if you think you're playing this, it can turn into this, which you don't want. Now, in these velocity switches, there are tricks to it. You can set inside your keyboard certain things. It depends on the keyboard. I can't get into what it is, but it's called a velocity curve. And in a Nord it'll be one thing, in a Yamaha it'll be somewhere else. But you can set the velocity curve to help. And a lot of the times when I'm traveling, I'll get different keyboards or the same keyboard, and I find that it's really good to kind of work with it and find out where its velocity switches are. We have a keyboard at Bethel here in Reading that for some reason some of the keys are broke, and no matter what you do, how soft you hit or how hard you hit, it sounds like that, and which is always a bummer. But it's good to know that that does that, and I just end up taping that key down and saying do not use. But anyway, so it's good to know these kinds of things, and it's good to know, a really soft velocity lends itself to being really good at quiet moments or with whole notes, or sometimes with patterns during quiet moments. Where it's not necessarily great as a rhythm, where you're... Because in the mix, that's actually not going to do very well. It's going to end up just kind of sounding like nothing. It's going to get buried and drowned out by everything else. The medium velocity, that's kind of this in-between, it's typically good for the quarters, which we already talked about. Where if you did it really quiet, again, in a live room through a sound system with drums and bass and everything, that's really just not going to punch and cut through very well. And likewise, really hard just isn't going to work in those moments. And then, the harder velocities tend to be rhythms, where you're doing the eighths. But, the next thing I want to talk about with this is that it's not just about staying at one velocity. The feel part of this, we're talking about tone, where you get different tone based upon how you feel, and then with the compression and how hard you actually play it, the compressor will do different things, and just feeling that. But what we want to talk about now is rhythm and how that adds to a song, which is pretty crucial. Sometimes you want to accent. So if you're playing eighths on a chorus and it's just straight eighths, then, unless it's actually like the biggest moment of the song, you probably don't want to do this. Because it's not going to end up sounding good in a mix unless it's the right moment. One of the things you can do with an eighth note rhythm is make the downbeat a little bit louder, and it'll add a little bit of groove. And that sounds something like this. And that adds a little more to something. You'll notice that it kind of already did with the robot thing we talked about, kind of already lends itself to having a different kind of feel, which is the... Like the first notes, first beats automatically get a little bit more love. Another one you can do is the beat right before the downbeat ends up being a little bit louder. And that sounds something like this. You know, and that tends to add a little bit of dynamic too. We talked about the piano being a percussive instrument, and I find a lot of the time I like to lock up with the drums, which kind of makes sense. Typically that's a bass thing, where the bass is kind of locking in with the kick, but I like to lock in with that kick and snare beat and groove a little bit to kind of lock in with the song, because in the low end of the piano, when you hit it a little bit harder, it has a really nice high end to it. Interestingly enough, you know, the low end is the boom and the high end is the sizzle. And so if I were to take out the high end real quick, you know, that's what I'm not talking about. But the part that I like is that part I just added back in. And that part, you know, that part of that sound ends up sounding really nice when you're, you know, locking in with that kick. And so the example I'll keep giving with the robot is a good example of that, because there's a part in the song where the kicks and the cymbals end up crashing to the same beat as the left hand. And so it ends up being kind of awesome. We're going to do right, and so you actually are locking in with the drums, and it creates this really cool thing that the bass by itself can't do and the drums by themselves can't do. And really, one of the only ways you can do that is with the keyboard with these full chords, or you can do it also. There's some guitar stuff you can do with that, but yeah, I have a lot of fun with that. Another trick you can do with the eighth notes and rhythms and stuff is switching from certain you know, certain patterns to other patterns. So we talked about standard eighths last time, and then we talked about the robot. And that kind of motion. And so, you know, if you were to go, say from, you know, say the song is going to build and it's just a chorus, and then it goes to a chorus build where the you know, the intensity level goes up, then it goes to an even, you know, larger chorus build. Well, you know, you have a few tools that you can always have somewhere to go. So maybe the chorus is going and you're just grooving with the drums in this robot, and then it builds and it builds. So each time I go through the progression, I'm going to do a slightly different groove. So it changes right here. And then I'm going to change it again. Keep hitting this little note. If you end up which is actually a good point also. If you're using a keyboard like this, that's not a full weighted keyboard, it's a lot easier to do these grace notes, which is why a lot of the time on this, this little lesson I've been doing single notes on the left hand, is because, you know, it's really easy to flurb the notes. So yeah, you build different rhythms together, and then really quick on a side note, you know, we talked about the grace notes, when I'm just kind of rolling chords humanly with the holes, where it's... Well, if you do that wrong, and again, you know, it's really easy. The difference on this keyboard between this and this is almost nothing. And so it's one of those things you have to get used to with the keyboard. And the last thing I want to go over before I give you guys some stuff to work on is that, you know, in other, we're focusing on piano, but there are other sounds, obviously, and they all kind of play a little differently. And this is just as important with other sounds. I've heard a lot of really great piano players, you know, play and translate really well on stage, and then all of a sudden you hand them a Rhodes or a pad or an electric piano or something, and they kind of, I don't want to say fall apart, but they kind of don't know what to do. And it's the same thing, you know, they have different velocity switches, They have different tones that work one way or the other. And so I want to give you an example real quick, and that's with a CP80, which basically is a terrible electric piano, but terrible is cool sometimes. And we'll talk about that in the sounds class more, but I want to give you an example of the velocity making a difference. And so this sound, if you're really quiet, sounds like that, and as you get louder, you know, which on first glance kind of sounds kind of weird, but all of a sudden, again, this comes from playing and learning. You find out, well, if I hammer in with an octave or multiple sounds, that clicky thing that happens, that kind of weird nasally click that happens when you hit it hard, ends up somehow getting compressed and squashed and blended and ends up sounding kind of nice. Or that's the low velocity. The hard velocity actually sounds kind of chimey and awesome. So anyway, that's it. Take some time, and what you want to do is kind of just get your piano and start learning where the velocity curve actually sits, and learning how hard to play it to make it sound great at a, you know, in the lower register and the high register with the patterns I showed you. Try to take some of those patterns and you know, learn how to make them even more rhythmic if you want, instead of just and start accenting notes and just seeing kind of how it feels. It's really important that you learn how to have great technique, because we talked about having great sounds and we talked about getting great tone, but if the feel isn't awesome, you know, you can have the best parts in the world, but you need to have great feel. And this week it's all about getting the feel and kind of the soul into the music. Thanks.